Hello everybody, my name is Mariako, and the time has come to look at the upcoming 1.18 update for Minecraft that will be released on November 30th. Now 1.18 is a strange one in that it is the second of a two-part update, something we have not had since the Adventure update with the official release of the game over 10 years ago. And the way the features were split between the two updates was a little weird. With 1.17, we essentially got all of the individual pieces of the update, and with 1.18, we're bringing those pieces together and presenting them as they're meant to be. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Minecraft 1.18, the Caves and Cliffs update, part 2. Let's jump right in with the big defining change of this update, the terrain. While 1.17 contained the bulk of the actual game content of the Caves and Cliffs update, 1.18 is what actually ties these features together and brings, well, the Caves and Cliffs. All of the blocks that felt strange to obtain previously now have their proper sources in the game, and those sources come primarily in the form of a variety of brand new mountain and cave biomes. That isn't where the terrain update stops, however. Part of the reason for splitting the Caves and Cliffs update in half was because the update to the terrain ended up having a far more reaching impact than just replacing a biome or two. In fact, while the only truly new biomes are those related to the Caves and the Cliffs, the entirety of terrain generation has been changed to make a more diverse and interesting world, as well as make it transition better across different biomes. You'll find towering cliffs, massive chasms, beautiful valleys, wide rivers, beaches that are more than just a thin line of sand on a coast, and the world will blend between all of this much better than it would have before. Truly, the world generation is worlds apart from where it was. This substantial change in terrain generation does have some big implications for the game. First is that world seeds, the numbers that determine how your world generates, now create entirely different worlds from what they were previously. Not only does this mean that existing seeds will not create the same worlds anymore, but for those that have played since before 1.7, this may be somewhat concerning because of how the game has handled these big, world-altering changes in the past. You may be familiar with the massive straight-edge borders that would signify the edge of old terrain versus new terrain in those older worlds. Outside of chunk errors, this should not be a problem in your current worlds thanks to a new feature of world generation that will try to blend between these two different areas. It's not going to look flawless, but it does mean that your old worlds should transition pretty well into the new update without fear of destroying your landscapes. And this should be true for any other changes as well going forward. It is also worth mentioning that this change to seeds is a universal change across both Java and Bedrock editions of the game, not only because the seeds have changed, but because world generation is now virtually identical between them. This means that, from 1.18 forward, if somebody shows a seed from one version of the game, it should almost always be extremely similar to the other version. You'll no longer need to question which version of the game a seed is for. This overall change in the terrain does have one other massive impact on the game, and that is a change in the build limit. For the past 9 years, we've had a build limit of 256 blocks, from Y0 up to Y255. You could not build above or below those limits. As of 1.18, you will be able to build down to Y-64 and up to Y320, an extra 64 blocks in each direction. Not only does this give much more room for deep caves and tall peaks, but it also makes the effective max height of a build a total of 384 blocks tall. Just one more small note about this increase in build height. It did make the previous cloud height feel a little bit too low, so they have increased that from Y128 up to Y192. So if your existing builds were clipping into clouds or were just above them, this will no longer be the case by default. So let's get to the more specific improvements to the world, and let's start from the bottom with the brand new cave systems. There's a couple obvious differences to point out, the first being the use of deep slate. If you skipped 1.17, deep slate is a darker stone type that comes in several variants and is noticeably more durable than regular stone, and previously it would generate in blobs at the lowest levels of the world, but its intended purpose was always to completely replace stone in the deepest parts of the new cave systems. So the transition from stone to deep slate will start at Y8, and below Y0, anything that would normally be stone is instead deep slate, including the ores being replaced by their deep slate variants. I should also note that, much like with the previously mentioned terrain blending, these new deeper caves have actually been implemented in a way that will transition neatly into your existing worlds. Anywhere that still has the bedrock layer at Y0 will actually remove that layer of bedrock and then generate the new lower cave systems beneath that with the new bedrock layer at Y-64. And if the original bedrock were removed somehow, it will simply leave a void beneath. This means that everywhere in your old worlds will automatically have these deep slate caves below Y0, and if you've ever removed the bedrock to have a hole into the void, that hole will still be present just as it was, it will simply be 64 blocks deeper down. As for the caves themselves and how they generate, those are a little bit different. The cave systems that we're used to seeing do still exist. We refer to those caves as carvers, but in addition to that older style of cave generation, there are also 3 new forms that caves can take. These forms have been dubbed noise caves, and they are also given their own individual names, which are, rather deliciously, spaghetti, noodle, and cheese caves, and these names represent the shapes that these caves take on. Spaghetti caves are long and winding. They are shaped a little bit differently and don't generate in quite the same way, but they are relatively similar to the caves we're used to seeing. Noodle caves are similar to spaghetti caves, but are a bit more chaotic and more claustrophobic. They're caves that you will need to kind of climb your way through rather than being open enough to easily run through like normal. Cheese caves are the big one. Quite literally, these are the types of caves that create the large open areas within cave systems, ranging from open room-like areas to enormous caverns that will often extend beyond your render distance. If you've seen anything of the new terrain before this, it was likely a clip of someone running or flying through one of these enormous caves, weaving in between the giant pillars that connect the floor and ceiling. Now, of course, those types of cave generation only convey the shape of the cave, the shell if you will, but the contents of those caves are largely shaped by the 2 new cave biomes, dripstone caves and lush caves. Of course, the contents of both of these biomes are blocks and items that we've mostly already had since 1.17, but now they are gathered together in their proper places, they're easier to find, easier to gather, and of course, they just look pretty cool. Let's first take a look at the dripstone caves. You're likely familiar with the small patches of dripstone blocks and pointed dripstone that can generate throughout regular cave systems, but the dripstone cave biome takes this to an entirely new level. Not only will the cave itself be covered in large stalactites and stalagmites of pointed dripstone, but larger caves can contain dripstone clusters, huge columns made of dripstone blocks that will connect from the floor to the ceiling. There are a couple other attributes to the dripstone caves regarding ores and mobs, but we'll cover those later on. First, let's take a peek at the lush caves. The lush caves in particular can look pretty fantastic, being completely overgrown by the variety of new plant blocks we received in 1.17. Azaleas, moss, cave vines, and dripleaf can now be easily found in one of these biomes versus the strange places they were in before. And in particular, this is important for dripleaf. In 1.17, the only source of small dripleaf was, rather annoyingly, the Wandering Trader, and while that would give you an infinite supply of big dripleaf by using bone meal, it did mean that small dripleaf itself was a very scarce block. It still can't be farmed, but it is vastly more accessible now. Just remember that you will need shears to pick them up. There is something sort of new coming with the lush caves though, and that's the spore blossom. This has technically been in the game since 1.17, you may have used it in creative or used a data pack to make it craftable, but as far as regular survival worlds go, it has been unobtainable. If you've forgotten, the spore blossom is a large pink flower that hangs from the ceiling and emits slow-moving green particles in a wide area around it. It's a fantastic block for detail building, and while it still isn't farmable, you will find them fairly frequently in lush caves and can break them by hand to pick them up. There is one other major thing about cave generation I'd like to cover here, and that is aquifers. Aquifers are underground bodies of water or lava that can form everything from small ponds to entire sunken cave systems. These can generate throughout any caves, occasionally doing so in really interesting places and making for some rather unique terrain. Once you go below Y0, every aquifer has a chance to instead be filled with lava, so do watch your step. We will be returning to the caves with other features later on, but let's start working our way up towards the cliffs for a moment. On the way, I do want to make a special mention of azalea trees. Not because they are any different in this update, they still look the same, and they still don't have their own wood type. For some reason. Mojang? Why? Anyway, it's because while we have had access to azalea trees by bone mealing azaleas, they would not generate naturally. The azalea tree will now generate out in the world, and will do so exclusively on the surface above lush cave biomes. They can generate anywhere on the surface, so if you are after a lush cave biome, searching for an azalea tree is a really good way to do so. This is important for one other reason though, and that is rooted dirt. We can get rooted dirt by growing azalea trees ourselves, but it only gives one block at a time. These natural azalea trees actually replace dirt below them with a dense column of rooted dirt that leads all the way down to the lush cave biome, which not only gives you an easy way to find your way into that cave, but it also gives you a tremendous amount of rooted dirt blocks. Based on some quick testing, I found that these give anywhere from a couple stacks to well over 1,000 blocks of this stuff. Let's move on up to the cliffs part of the update with the renovations to the mountain biome. This has become a much more substantial change than simply improving the existing mountains. Instead, what we've come to think of as the mountain or extreme hills biomes still exist under a different name, while the term mountains has been given to a series of new biomes. The existing mountain biomes have been renamed to windswept hills, including the wooded mountains and gravelly mountains variants, now being windswept forest and windswept gravelly hills respectively. This was solely a renaming of these biomes. They will still be a little bit different due to the overall changes in terrain generation, but in the end they are much the same as they were. The true update to the mountains is in the new biomes. The mountains moniker is now given to a set of 6 individual biomes. These are the meadow, grove, snowy slopes, frozen peaks, jagged peaks, and stony peaks. Each of these serves a slightly different purpose in contributing to creating a much more diverse mountainous terrain than we have ever had before. All of these biome variants can contain emerald ores, though ore distribution has changed, as we'll cover shortly, and all of them can also generate pillager outposts. That's about where the similarities end though. Meadows are the lowest level of mountains. Essentially, these will often act as the foothills at the base of a mountainous area, though it can occasionally also generate on its own. You can think of this as a slightly hillier version of the plains biome. It can even generate a plains-style village inside of it. The meadow biome will occasionally generate an oak or birch tree, which will 100% of the time have a bee's nest in it, and it also generates most types of small flowers, the exceptions being the tulips, blue orchids, lily of the valley, and of course the wither rose. As far as passive mobs, it will only spawn sheep, rabbits, and rather strangely donkeys. Note that it is specifically donkeys. The next biome is the Grove, a snowy forest of spruce trees that can generate on the side of mountains, in between the lowest levels and the peaks, particularly when there are other forest-type biomes in the area. This biome is visually similar to the snowy taiga, but its top layer is most often made of actual snow blocks, along with a lot of the powder snow that was added in 1.17. Do keep that in mind as an option now. You can go out and actually gather powder snow in large quantities instead of creating large farms if that is more practical for you. As far as mobs go, you will find rabbits and wolves here, along with the boxes. If the mountain is generating in an area surrounded by more sparse biomes, the side of it may instead become a snowy slopes biome. This is a largely barren biome covered in a deep layer of snow blocks and powder snow blocks, with stone cliffs peeking out beneath. These do not have much in the way of plant life, and the only passive mobs that can spawn here are rabbits and goats, though you will occasionally also find an igloo here. This does, however, make for a great place to pick up a lot of snow blocks quickly. Moving up, we finally reach the peak of the mountains, and the first of the 3 mountain peak biomes, the frozen peaks. Unlike the other 2 peak biomes we'll see shortly, this biome tends to generate with smaller, smoother peaks made of snow, as well as large sheets of packed ice representing glaciers. This does of course make them another good source for packed ice if you're having a hard time finding ice-spiked plains or frozen ocean biomes. They are again a relatively barren biome, with no plant life and the only passive mob spawning here being goats. Next we have the Jagged Peaks biome, another type of snow-capped mountain peak, but this one is, as the name implies, much more jagged. This biome is meant to replicate what many of us think of when we think of mountain peaks: very tall, snow-capped, pointed mountains. This biome in particular is very good for finding exposed ore if you are early on in a world and don't want to go caving, specifically iron, coal, and emeralds. It is also another biome that can spawn goats, but again, that is the only passive mob that will spawn here. Finally, we have the Stony Peaks. This is essentially a warm variant of the previously mentioned Jagged Peaks biome. In other words, it is tall, pointed mountain peaks without the snow. This is what is more likely to generate in warmer areas of your world, surrounded by things like deserts or savannas. The Stony Peaks also have a lot of exposed ore, as well as large deposits of calcite, the white blocks that generate in the shell of amethyst geodes. These deposits can generate in massive quantities, so if you need a ton of calcite for building, this is probably the best source for it now. The biome does also have a unique, fairly vibrant green grass color, as opposed to the much more subdued aqua color that the rest of the mountain and windswept hills biomes use. As far as mobs go, there are no passive mobs of any kind here, not even goats. There are a few other changes to biomes in general that I would like to mention briefly, first being the overall list of biomes looking quite a bit different due to some sub-biomes being redundant and getting removed, as well as several others being renamed. Biome names have been shifting around a lot in the last few versions, and it can get a little confusing, but these changes seem like they will help with that in the long run. First off, the sub-biomes that were entirely removed. Most notably, this relates to sub-biomes that were previously dependent on height. With the way terrain generation works now, they are simply no longer necessary, and the kinds of generation they brought will happen naturally without them, so those sub-biomes that use terms like hills or plateau have been removed entirely. On existing worlds, these biomes will simply show up as their base biome type. There were also a few sub-biomes that just didn't generate to begin with. Obviously, those have been removed as well. As for the biomes that were renamed, this seems mostly to try and create a more consistent naming convention across sub-biomes. For example, the biomes that center around having larger than normal trees, like the giant spruce taiga or the tall birch forest, have been given the name Old Growth. So they are now Old Growth Spruce Taiga and Old Growth Birch Forest. Another example is that the Snowy Tundra, being the only holdout of the word tundra, and that has been renamed to Snowy Plains. Of course, as previously mentioned, there's also the renaming of the various existing mountain biomes, aka the extreme hills, as many of us know them, to things like Windswept Hills and Windswept Forest. Now is a good time to talk about ore distribution, because it has changed quite significantly. Previously, the way ores generated was pretty simplistic, and as a result, there was one specific level where players would always go to mine no matter what resource they wanted, because they could just get them all at that level. This is no longer the case. While some ores do still have a simple range in which they generate without much variance, every ore now also has specific areas where they have their highest rates, and there is no perfect level where you get everything at once. On top of that, there are a couple other mechanics to certain ores, such as spawning more often in certain biomes, being less likely if exposed to air, or the new ore veins, which we'll cover shortly. So we have this chart to help depict the base rates of ores, not accounting for most of those additional mechanics. Essentially, the y-axis of the graph is the y-axis of your world, and the width of the bar represents how common an ore is at that particular y-level. One very easy example of the impact of this is emeralds, which still only generate in mountain-type biomes, also including the older-style windswept hills, but now generate in much higher quantities the higher up you go. So, if you want to mine emerald ores, you will now want to climb up into the mountains and either dig out the frequently exposed ore blocks, or just mine away entire mountain peaks. You'll notice that you will also be getting a lot of iron and coal by doing things this way as well, even though they also generate elsewhere. At the opposite end of the spectrum, diamond starts generating at Y16, but at that level it will be very rare. The further down you go, the more common it will become, and as you get close to Y-64, it should be noticeably more common than it has been in the past. At the same time, if you want copper, your best bet is to mine around Y48, and while it will generate up to 64 blocks above or below that, it will become increasingly rare the further away you get from that ideal Y48 level. One last example, just to make sure this is clear, redstone will generate at a constant rate between Y16 and -64. But starting at Y-32, there is also a chance for another vein to generate for more redstone ore, and this is more likely the lower you go. So, while you can get redstone in reasonable amounts anywhere below Y16, the highest quantities will be near the bottom of the world. So hopefully you get the general idea regarding the new ore generation. But, as I mentioned before, there are other factors in how ore generates. Let's start with air exposure. If we look at our chart, we can see several ores are marked with either reduced air exposure or no air exposure. Much like it sounds, this means that those ores will either have a reduced chance of generating if they are exposed to the air, or will skip generating entirely if they would be exposed to the air. Generally, this isn't a big deal because these rates have been carefully balanced, but it does mean that these ores will be seen less often than expected in caves, and you'll find them slightly more often by digging for them. Do keep in mind that this only applies to air. If an ore tries to generate in, say, a flooded cave, it will generate as if it is entirely encased, so do keep that in mind. Another way for ore to generate, or more specifically for either iron or copper to generate, is something called an ore vein. This is a rare type of ore generation that will create a massive streak of ore across the world, one that contains a truly huge amount of ore blocks, and even some of the raw metal blocks of that same ore type. When one of these ore veins generates, if it's above Y0, it will be made of a mixture of copper ore, raw copper blocks, and granite. If it's below Y0, it will be made of iron ore, raw iron blocks, and tuff. Mining through this giant, snaking structure can net you literally thousands of these ores if it's a particularly large ore vein. So do keep an eye out for mixtures of copper and granite, or iron and tuff. One final, very quick note relating to ores, copper ore now drops 2 to 5 copper per block, up from 2 to 3. Of course, this can also be increased with the fortune enchantment as well. Overall, this means you should be getting a noticeable amount more copper from your mining trips, especially if you find an ore vein. Copper will also generate in larger blobs within dripstone cave biomes, so if you're a fan of caving for your ore and you're after copper, keep an eye out for those. In addition to all of the changes to the world itself, there were also quite a few minor changes to the structures that generate within it that you should be aware of. The Amethyst Geode now only generates below Y30. The rates have been balanced to make them about as common as they were before, you will just need to go down a little bit further to find them. Fossils that generate below Y-8 will generate with deep slate diamond ore blocks instead of coal ore blocks, as they do when above that level. Dungeons are now more common, especially when below Y0. Apparently their rates were actually bugged since 1.7, making them less common than they should have been for quite some time now. Mineshafts will tend to generate higher up in Badlands biomes, which should lead to more exposed mineshafts in these areas. Jungle pyramids will no longer generate on water, and desert pyramids will also no longer generate on water, and will also now spawn on the surface instead of at a set Y level, though they will still tend to be partially buried. With nearly the entire focus of this update being on the terrain, there haven't been many changes in terms of blocks, but there were a few small changes worth covering. First, cave vines, twisting vines, weeping vines, and kelp can all have their growth permanently stopped by breaking the tip with shears. Essentially, this is just setting the growth age of that last remaining block to 25, so they will not grow any further. Unfortunately, this still isn't possible on normal vines, the only one of these kinds of blocks that players couldn't already control the height of with a bit of patience. You're killing me here, Mojang. Anyway, next, Big Drip Leaf has had its placement criteria restricted slightly. Previously, it could be placed on most surfaces. Now it needs to be placed either on clay or one of the dirt block variants. That's dirt, farmland, grass, anything of that sort. The enchanting table now emits a light level of 7 on Java to match its bedrock counterpart, and blocks of copper can be used in the stone cutter to be converted into 4 cut copper for a single block, instead of the usual recipe converting 1 to 1. Items also aren't seeing much in the way of new additions for part 2 of the update, but there is one of note, a new music disc. This is another addition by composer Lena Raine, the one who created the music for the Pigstep disc, as well as several other existing ambient tracks in the game. This disc, named Other Side and identified by its blue and green central ring, can be found with a low chance in the corridor chests of strongholds and with a very low chance in dungeon chests. That new disc is not the only new music added to the game, however. There are also 8 other new background music tracks added to the game to play across new biomes, as well as on the main menu. Lena Raine is responsible for 5 of these tracks, with the other 3 created by a new composer to the game, Kumi Tanioka, a composer famous for their contributions to series like Final Fantasy, Harvest Moon, and Smash. Each one of these new tracks has a handful of different biomes that they can play in, and the 5 tracks that Lena Raine composed can also play in the main menu along with the existing menu music. So I'll have a list of those on your screen right now so you can see the track titles and where they will play, and I'll also do my best to have links to all of these songs on YouTube down in the description, that way you can check them out if you're interested. Let's move on and talk about mobs a little bit. Again, there aren't any big additions as far as things like new mobs go. There are some minor changes to address, but first there is one very significant change relating to mobs. More specifically, how and where they will spawn. There's been a change to the light level requirements for where mobs can spawn. Previously, this was any full block where the block light level was 7 or lower, but this has been reduced all the way down to 0. This means that mobs can only spawn if there is no physical source of light reaching the block they are trying to spawn on. Do note that this is not the case in regards to skylight. Mobs will still spawn on the surface at night, they just will not spawn anywhere near a physical light source. The impact of this change really can't be overstated. The difference this makes in how much light you need to use in your builds is absolutely enormous, and it makes being able to actually utilize dark areas in your build for aesthetics infinitely easier. For people who really enjoy aesthetic building in survival, this is genuinely a game changer. It's something that will actually dictate how your builds look going forward. Do not underestimate the value of this change. As for the rest of the changes relating to mobs, it's mostly pretty minor. Goats now only spawn in the Snowy Slopes, Jagged Peaks, and Frozen Peaks biomes. I mentioned them spawning in these biomes previously, but it's important to note that they will no longer spawn in the Windswept Hills type biomes. Axolotls will now only spawn in the Lush Cave biomes, and only if there is a clay block less than 5 blocks below where they are trying to spawn. They also have their own mob cap now, no longer sharing with the Glow Squid. Drowned can now spawn within aquifers if they are inside of a dripstone cave biome. Cod, salmon, pufferfish, tropical fish, squid, and dolphins will now only spawn in water between Y50 and Y64. The exception to this is that tropical fish can also spawn in lush cave biomes now, and within there they can spawn at any height. The glow squid will now only spawn in water below Y30. The various types of illagers will no longer attack baby villagers, and horses, mules, and donkeys will now follow players wielding golden carrots and apples. Next up, let's cover advancements. The only substantial change to existing advancements is the inevitable change to adventuring time, the advancement for discovering every biome. With some biomes removed and others added, there are now 50 different biomes required to get this advancement. As for new advancements, there are 4 of them. Caves and Cliffs, for falling from the top to the bottom of the overworld. Feels Like Home, for riding a strider on lava for 50 blocks in the overworld. Sound of Music, for playing music with a jukebox in a meadow biome. And Star Trader, for trading with a villager at the build height limit. Let's go on to the UI and menu changes. There is one small but nice improvement to the in-game UI, and that is a change on how status effects, such as those you get from beacons or potions, are displayed when you have your inventory open. These will now be shown on the right side of your inventory, and depending on the amount of space they have, they can switch between showing the full information or only the icons. This means that they will always be clear and visible without being intrusive. Moving to the menus, we of course got a new main menu background once again, this time showing an example of our lovely new terrain. Of course, as mentioned earlier, there will also be several new music tracks cycling on the menus as well. The control menu has been renovated a bit, with the sprint and sneak toggle settings now showing up here, and keybinds being moved into a sub-menu that you click into. Both of those toggles do still show up under the accessibility settings as well, by the way. There is also a new setting under the accessibility options for disabling the flashes from lightning strikes, and under the Music and Sound Settings tab, there is now an option to change the output device the game uses, meaning you could specify it if you want to always play through your headphones or whatever device you want. Under the Video Settings tab, there is also a new toggle for an autosave indicator. If this is enabled while you're playing single player, there will occasionally be a small icon in the bottom right of your screen indicating that the world is saving. This is enabled by default, so you will see this popping up unless you go and disable it. There were also a couple very interesting options added under the Video Settings tab that relate to performance. The first is the Chunk Builder setting, and this determines how chunks are updated. There are 3 options to this setting. Fully blocking, which is the behavior that we're kind of used to seeing in the game, and it makes it so the nearest chunks are always updated as soon as possible. Semi-blocking, which will prioritize the nearest chunks, but only with certain changes, like when blocks are placed or destroyed, and threaded. This spreads the task of updating chunks across multiple threads, and theoretically this should be much more performant, but there will occasionally be quirks where chunks don't visually update in quite the right order. All of that essentially means that if you want the best looking and least visually glitchy experience, you go with fully blocking. If you want the best performing, you go with threaded, and you can try out semi-blocking if you want an in-between. Right next to that, there is another option called Simulation Distance. This determines the distance that the world is processing things like entities, block updates, fluid simulation, that kind of thing. By separating this from render distance itself, it means you can increase your render distance to see further with much less of an impact on your game's performance. Just keep in mind that those extra chunks you get from this are essentially visual and won't be doing things like running your automated farms, for example. Of course, this setting is local only, so if you're playing on a server, it will not be used. However, there is a new server property to do this, Simulation-Distance, that controls what this distance is for players on your server. As for command and technical changes, once again, not too much with this update. There was the inclusion of the /JFR command. This is for the Java Flight Recorder. Essentially, this is for debugging purposes and isn't something nearly anybody will ever have a use for, but it's one of those things that's very useful if you are one of the few that does. There is also a new tag on spawners, the Custom Spawn Rules tag, which currently lets map makers modify the light level that spawners will be able to spawn mobs at. This is super helpful as it means that they can do things like make spawners that can't be easily disabled, for example. As usual, there are also a number of miscellaneous changes to the game that are worth mentioning briefly. A few quick ones. Sprinting no longer ends if you just barely brush up against a block. Buried treasure chests can now contain water-breathing potions. Some facets of world generation are now multi-threaded, which should lead to a noticeable performance improvement when generating new terrain. The algorithm for deciding where the world's spawn point is has been improved and should no longer put players in really detrimental areas like the middle of the ocean when starting new worlds. Worlds from version 1.2 and earlier, should you find a world on an old hard drive for example, cannot be opened directly into 1.18 or later. You can still update those worlds by going to a version in between, like 1.7, and then upgrading from there though. There was also the inclusion of something called the Illager Alt font. This is a runic-looking font used in Minecraft Dungeons, and it was added to Minecraft's files. Currently, this has no impact on the game, it's just a really interesting thing to keep in mind for the future. Of course, there were quite a few bug fixes as well, most of which were pretty inconsequential, but there are some worth covering. Drowned will now spawn in warm ocean biomes. They didn't before apparently, so if you've been building in one, keep that in mind. You can no longer exit the world border by riding entities. Sleeping no longer resets the rain and thunder timers, so you won't perpetually skip the weather ever changing by sleeping anymore. And axolotls will now avoid taking damage when pathfinding, no more mindlessly walking into lava and whatnot. So with that, we're actually done. That is everything coming in Minecraft 1.18. However, depending on how much you follow the development of the game, you may have noticed some glaring omissions. There are a few features that were delayed even further beyond Part 2 of the update. Just to give you a brief idea of what we know about those features right now, archaeology is currently in a little bit of a limbo, and we don't know when this one is coming. We know it's still a planned feature, but it seems like they want to get more out of the idea, and it just isn't there yet. It doesn't seem like it will be in 1.19, but we can only wait and see. There's a similar story for both bundles and the goat horn item. They are still plans and even partially obtainable. You can get the bundle using the /give command, for example, but their purpose and use wasn't quite well defined enough, and they too have been delayed for an undisclosed amount of time. Again, they currently aren't planned for 1.19 as far as we know, but we'll see how things go as that update progresses. Easily the biggest one, though, is the Warden and the area it will inhabit, the Deep Dark. This would have been a great fit for 1.18, but for better or worse, the scope for this change grew quite a lot from when we first saw it. Instead of simply being a hulking monster roaming in some random cave, the Warden has turned into a bit of a horror game boss monster that emerges when players intrude on a new underground city structure. It's become much more than it was originally meant to be, and it's gotten delayed as a result. The good news is that we do know that we're getting the Warden and the Deep Dark in 1.19. We were given a preview of that update, the Wild Update as it's called, and the Warden is officially a big part of it. That update will also bring the swamp changes that lost the Minecon Live 2019 vote, the allay, and undoubtedly a lot more that we have yet to see, but all of that is for the future. With that out of the way, I've covered everything I can here today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and are now prepared for the Caves and Cliffs update Part 2 when it reaches your worlds and servers on November 30th. As always, there will be a link to the full changelog and any other resources in the description, and if you have any questions regarding the update, feel free to ask them down below, and I'll do my best to help you out. Thank you for watching, have an amazing day, and I'll see you next time.